The crimson drops that fell from Chief Librarian Mephiston's fingertips were not his own blood. They belonged to the daemon that had just learned the terrible truth about facing the Lord of Death in single combat. Steam rose from the ancient stone floor of the Blood Angels' fortress monastery as the creature's essence burned away, leaving only the acrid smell of sulfur and the echo of its final, disbelieving shriek. Mephiston stood motionless in the chapel's dim light, his psychic hood crackling with residual energy. The force weapon in his grip still hummed with power, its blade wreathed in coruscating blue fire that cast dancing shadows across the sacred murals depicting Sanguinius in all his glory. But it was not the demon's destruction that held the Lord of Death's attention. It was the silence that followed. For the first time in over 4 centuries, the whispers had stopped. The black rage, that terrible curse that had claimed so many of his battle brothers, had fallen silent in his mind. The screaming voices of the damned, the endless replay of Sanguinius's death at the hands of Horus, the crushing weight of inherited madness that should have driven him into the ranks of the Death Company decades ago. All of it had simply ceased to exist. He was alone in his own thoughts, master of his own consciousness in a way that no blood angel had ever been. The implications of this moment would reshape the chapter's understanding of their curse forever. But first, there was the matter of explaining to Chapter Master Dante why the Southern Chapel now bore the claw marks of something that should never have been able to breach the monastery's defenses, and why the air itself seemed to recoil from Mephiston's presence, as if recognizing something that defied the natural order. Brother Librarian Mephiston of the Blood Angels had died in the depths of a Death Company assault on the world of Armageddon. What stood in his place was something that wore his face and carried his memories, but had transcended the limitations that defined Space Marine existence. The galaxy would learn to fear this transformation, though few would understand its true cost. The man who would become the Lord of Death began his existence as Calistarius, a battle brother of the Blood Angels' 5th Company. His service record spoke of competence rather than brilliance, dedication rather than innovation. He was the kind of Space Marine who formed the backbone of any chapter, reliable in combat, steadfast in faith, capable of following orders without question or hesitation. For over 2 centuries, he served with distinction, but without particular recognition, his name appearing in company rosters and casualty reports with the mechanical regularity of military bureaucracy. His psychic potential manifested later than was typical for most librarians, emerging during a particularly brutal campaign against Orc raiders in the Griffon subsector. The signs were subtle at first: prescient awareness of enemy movements, an uncanny ability to anticipate the flow of battle, moments of clarity that seemed to extend beyond normal human perception. His squad sergeant noted these anomalies in his regular reports, though he attributed them to combat experience rather than supernatural ability. It was epistolary Malachim Foros who first recognized the true nature of Calistarius's gifts during a boarding action against an Orc space hulk. The young battle brother had somehow known exactly which corridor the greenskin assault would come from, had positioned his squad in perfect ambush formation without any tactical briefing or reconnaissance data to support his decision. When questioned about his reasoning, Calistarius could only speak of a feeling, an intuition that had guided his actions. The testing that followed confirmed what Foros suspected. Calistarius possessed significant psychic potential, though it was raw and unfocused, dangerous if left untrained. The decision to transfer him to the Librarium was made despite his advanced age and extensive conditioning as a line trooper. Most psychic Space Marines were identified and trained from their earliest days as scouts, their powers carefully shaped and channeled through decades of instruction. Calistarius would need to unlearn years of mental conditioning while simultaneously mastering abilities that most librarians spent their entire lives perfecting. The transition was more difficult than anyone anticipated. His mind had been shaped by 2 centuries of combat, hardened into patterns of thought that were antithetical to the flexibility required for psychic manipulation. Where young initiates could bend their consciousness like flowing water, Calistarius's thoughts moved with the mechanical precision of a bolter's firing mechanism. His first attempts at psychic projection resulted in feedback loops that left him unconscious for days. His efforts to manipulate the warp produced violent disruptions that shattered training equipment and injured his instructors. Chief Librarian Erasmus Tycho personally oversaw his instruction, recognizing both the potential and the danger represented by such a late manifestation of psychic ability. Tycho was a master of the mental disciplines, a warrior philosopher whose understanding of the warp's nature had been earned through centuries of careful study and practical application. Under his guidance, Calistarius began to learn the fundamental techniques that would allow him to channel his gifts safely. The process was agonizing. Every lesson required him to fight against instincts that had been drilled into him since his recruitment as a scout. The meditative states necessary for psychic focus conflicted with the constant vigilance that kept Space Marines alive in combat. The mental flexibility required for warp manipulation seemed to threaten the rigid discipline that defined his existence. More than once, he requested permission to return to line duty, to abandon the painful transformation that the librarian demanded, but something kept him committed to the path. Perhaps it was pride, the refusal to admit failure in any endeavor undertaken in the Emperor's name. Perhaps it was curiosity about the strange new vistas of perception that his training occasionally revealed. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that his psychic gifts were not merely random chance, but part of some larger design that would only be revealed through complete mastery of his abilities. Years passed before he achieved the basic competency expected of a lexicanum. His progress was measured not in months, but in decades. Each small advancement earned through enormous effort and frequent setbacks. His fellow librarians watched his struggles with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing his dedication while questioning whether the investment of time and resources was justified by the results. The first sign of his true potential came during the cleansing of Mordax Prime, where a chaos cult had established a foothold in the planet's primary hive city. The operation was intended as a training exercise for junior librarians, a chance to practice their skills against relatively weak psychic opposition under carefully controlled conditions. Calistarius was assigned to the assault force as an observer, his role limited to maintaining communication with orbital assets, while more experienced battle brothers dealt with the cultists' psychers. The plan collapsed within minutes of insertion. Intelligence reports had severely underestimated the cult's capabilities, and the Blood Angels found themselves facing not amateur witches, but a full coven of chaos sorcerers backed by demonic entities. 3 librarians died in the opening exchanges, their minds burned out by psychic assaults that overwhelmed their defenses. The surviving members of the strike force were pinned down in a collapsed hab block, while enemy reinforcements moved to surround their position. Calistarius acted without orders, drawing on power reserves he had never accessed before. His psychic assault on the cultist positions was crude but devastating, a focused projection of pure force that shattered buildings and turned the sorcerer's protective wards against them. He maintained the attack for over an hour, his mind somehow remaining stable despite channeling energies that should have destroyed his sanity within minutes. By the time reinforcements arrived, the entire district had been reduced to rubble, and every trace of chaos taint had been purged from the area. The victory came at a price. Calistarius collapsed immediately after the battle, his body racked by seizures as his nervous system struggled to process the psychic feedback from his exertions. He remained in a coma for 3 months, his vital signs fluctuating wildly as his enhanced physiology fought to repair damage that extended beyond the merely physical. When he finally awakened, his fellow librarians noticed changes that went deeper than the expected effects of psychic exhaustion. His eyes had taken on a different quality, reflecting light in ways that seemed inconsistent with normal human anatomy. His presence affected sensitive equipment, causing data slates to flicker and vox units to produce static when he approached. Most disturbing of all were the reports from chapter serfs, who spoke of seeing shadows that moved independently of his position, as if his psychic awakening had somehow attracted the attention of things that existed beyond normal perception. Chief Librarian Tycho ordered extensive testing to determine the nature and extent of these changes. The results were troubling, but inconclusive. Calistarius's psychic potential had increased exponentially, his power rating jumping from barely adequate to exceptional in the space of a single engagement. But the readings also showed instabilities and anomalies that defied conventional understanding. His connection to the warp seemed to fluctuate randomly, sometimes barely detectable, other times registering as powerfully as a full epistolary. More concerning were the psychological evaluations. Calistarius claimed to remember nothing of his actions during the assault on Mordax Prime, describing the experience as a period of darkness followed by sudden awakening in the chapter's medical facilities. But the memory gaps extended beyond the specific incident, encompassing periods of his training that he could no longer recall with clarity. It was as if his psychic awakening had somehow rewritten portions of his personal history, editing out experiences that no longer served whatever purpose drove his transformation. Despite these concerns, his promotion to full librarian was approved based on his demonstrated capabilities. The Blood Angels needed psychic specialists, and Calistarius had proven his effectiveness in combat even if the mechanisms behind his power remained mysterious. He was assigned to the Third Company under Captain Tycho, beginning a new phase of service that would test both his abilities and his sanity in ways that his previous training had never anticipated. The Blood Angels' genetic heritage carries within it the seeds of their greatest weakness, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, twin curses that mark them as the most tragically flawed of all the Emperor's Space Marine chapters. Every son of Sanguinius lives with the knowledge that his enhanced physiology contains not just superhuman capabilities, but also the potential for madness that will eventually claim him as surely as any enemy's weapon. For most Blood Angels, these curses manifest gradually. The Red Thirst begins as an increased appetite for combat, a slight preference for close-quarters engagements over ranged warfare. Over decades or centuries, it slowly intensifies until the affected Marine requires careful monitoring to prevent him from losing control during battle. The Black Rage typically remains dormant until triggered by extreme stress or trauma, at which point the victim experiences vivid hallucinations of Sanguinius's final battle against Horus and must be assigned to the Death Company before he becomes dangerous to his battle brothers. Librarian Calistarius experienced neither the gradual onset nor the sudden triggering that marked normal manifestations of these conditions. Instead, his symptoms appeared sporadically, seemingly at random, with an intensity that suggested his psychic abilities were somehow amplifying the effects of his genetic inheritance. His first recorded episode occurred during a routine training exercise 6 months after his promotion to full librarian status. The exercise involved a simulated boarding action against a mock-up of an enemy vessel constructed in the chapter's training facilities. Calistarius was assigned to lead a squad of Devastator Marines in providing fire support for the primary assault force. The scenario was designed to test coordination between different specialist units, a relatively straightforward tactical problem that any experienced officer should have been able to handle without difficulty. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. Calistarius positioned his heavy weapons teams to provide overlapping fields of fire, coordinated their targeting with the advancing assault squads, and maintained communication with the exercise controllers. His performance was competent but unremarkable, exactly what might be expected from a newly promoted librarian still learning to balance his psychic abilities with his tactical responsibilities. Then, something changed. Witnesses later described the transformation as sudden and complete, as if Calistarius had been replaced by someone else wearing his armor. His tactical communications became confused and contradictory, referring to enemies that did not exist and objectives that were not part of the exercise. He began issuing orders in a voice that carried harmonics impossible for normal human vocal cords to produce, speaking words in languages that no one present could identify. The situation deteriorated rapidly when he turned his psychic powers against his own men. Force bolts intended for training targets instead struck the Devastator Marines under his command, their protective armor offering no defense against attacks that bypassed physical defenses entirely. 3 battle brothers were seriously injured before the exercise controllers could activate the facility's psychic dampening fields and restore some measure of sanity to the situation. When the dampeners took effect, Calistarius collapsed as if his strings had been cut, his massive frame striking the training deck with enough force to crack the reinforced flooring. Medical teams found him unconscious but stable, his vital signs gradually returning to normal parameters as the psychic interference faded. When he regained consciousness 2 hours later, he claimed to remember nothing of the incident, expressing confusion about why he was in the medical bay instead of completing the training exercise. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing inconsistencies in the telemetry data recorded during the incident. The facility's psychic monitoring equipment had registered energy discharges consistent with a Class Alpha Psyker operating at maximum power, readings that should have been impossible for someone of Calistarius's documented abilities. More troubling still were the audio recordings, which captured vocalizations that seemed to originate from multiple sources, despite the fact that only Calistarius had been speaking. Chief Librarian Tycho personally reviewed all available evidence, consulting with tech marines and medical specialists in an attempt to understand what had occurred. Their conclusion was that Calistarius had experienced a manifestation of the Black Rage, but one unlike anything previously documented in chapter records. Instead of the typical fixation on Sanguinius's death, he had seemed to be responding to stimuli that existed only in his altered perception, fighting battles that belonged to some other time and place entirely. The recommended course of action would normally have been immediate assignment to the Death Company, removing the affected Marine from active duty before he could endanger his battle brothers. But Calistarius's condition did not fit the established patterns. He showed no signs of the persistent delusions that marked permanent Black Rage victims. No evidence of the violent tendencies that made Death Company Marines dangerous to be around. Between episodes, he functioned normally, performing his duties with the same competence he had always displayed. Tycho made the controversial decision to keep Calistarius on active status while implementing enhanced monitoring procedures. The librarian would continue his normal duties, but always under observation, with psychic dampening equipment standing ready to intervene if another episode occurred. It was a calculated risk based on the chapter's desperate need for experienced psychers and the hope that understanding Calistarius's condition might provide insights into the nature of the Blood Angel's genetic curses. For several months, the decision seemed justified. Calistarius performed his duties without incident, his tactical competence and psychic abilities making him a valuable asset to Third Company operations. He participated in 3 successful campaigns, his contributions earning commendation from Captain Tycho and grudging respect from battle brothers who had initially been suspicious of his presence among them. But the episodes continued, occurring with increasing frequency and intensity. During a boarding action against Chaos Raiders, he spent 20 minutes fighting enemies that his squadmates could not see, his bolter rounds striking empty air while he screamed warnings about demon princes that existed only in his perception. A week later, while conducting psychic reconnaissance on a contested world, he began speaking in what sounded like High Gothic, but with grammatical structures that violated every known rule of the ancient language. Each incident was followed by the same pattern of unconsciousness and amnesia, leaving Calistarius with no memory of his actions during the episodes. Medical examinations revealed nothing abnormal, his brain scans showing the same patterns as any other space marine. But the frequency of the occurrences was increasing, and their duration was growing longer. What had begun as brief moments of confusion were evolving into extended periods of dissociation that left him effectively helpless. The breaking point came during the Third Company's deployment to the agri-world of Holst Prime, where Orc raiders had been raiding agricultural facilities and disrupting food shipments to nearby systems. Intelligence indicated a relatively minor incursion, the kind of cleanup operation that could be handled by a single company with minimal support. Calistarius was assigned to the command squad. His role focused on psychic reconnaissance and communication with orbital assets. The Orcs had established their main base in an abandoned processing facility on the planet's southern continent. The structure was massive but lightly defended, its corrugated metal walls offering concealment rather than serious protection. Third Company's assault plan called for a three-pronged attack that would prevent the Greenskins from concentrating their forces while ensuring that none could escape to trouble the local population. Calistarius performed admirably during the initial phases of the operation. His psychic senses allowed him to locate hidden Orc positions and identify weak points in their defensive preparations. His tactical advice helped Captain Tycho adjust the assault plan to account for enemy dispositions that conventional reconnaissance had missed. For the first hour of combat, his contributions were exactly what might be expected from an experienced librarian supporting a standard infantry assault. The change began as the Blood Angels penetrated deeper into the facility. The Orcs had established their command post in the building's central processing chamber, a cavernous space filled with rusted machinery and makeshift fortifications. As Third Company closed in on the objective, Calistarius suddenly stopped responding to Vox communications. His attention focused on something that no one else could perceive. When his squad mates attempted to determine what had captured his attention, they found him staring at a section of wall that appeared identical to every other part of the chamber. But to Calistarius, that wall seemed to have become transparent, revealing vistas that belonged to no world in Imperial space. He began walking toward it with mechanical precision, his movements suggesting that he was responding to orders from someone who was not present. Brother Sergeant Valoris attempted to redirect his attention, but Calistarius seemed unaware of his battle brother's presence. He continued his advance toward the wall, murmuring words in the same unknown language that had marked his previous episodes. When Valoris physically blocked his path, Calistarius looked through him as if he did not exist, then carefully stepped around the sergeant as if navigating an obstacle that required no particular attention. The situation escalated when Calistarius reached the wall and began attacking it with his force weapon. The blade, designed to channel psychic energy into devastating close combat attacks, carved through the reinforced metal as if it were parchment. But the destruction was strangely precise, following patterns that seemed to serve some architectural purpose rather than simple violence. He was not simply attacking the wall, but methodically dismantling it according to some blueprint that existed only in his altered perception. Behind the wall lay nothing but empty space and the facility's outer hull. But Calistarius continued his work with unwavering determination, cutting through layer after layer of construction, as if excavating something of enormous importance. His psychic aura began to fluctuate wildly, sometimes blazing with enough intensity to overload nearby equipment, other times dropping to levels barely detectable by the chapter's monitoring systems. It was Brother Codicier Antros who finally recognized what was happening. The patterns that Calistarius was cutting into the facility's structure matched architectural elements from the Blood Angels' fortress monastery on Baal. Specifically, they corresponded to the layout of the Tower of Amareo, the sacred space where chapter librarians conducted their most sensitive rituals. Somehow, Calistarius was experiencing a vision of home while simultaneously believing that he could physically access it by dismantling the Orc facility around him. The episode lasted for 3 hours, during which time Calistarius remained completely unresponsive to external stimuli. His battle brothers were forced to work around him as they completed the mission objectives, clearing the facility of Orc resistance while their librarian methodically destroyed large sections of the building. Medical attempts to sedate him proved ineffective, his enhanced physiology somehow metabolizing the drugs faster than they could take effect. When the episode finally ended, Calistarius collapsed into unconsciousness, just as he had during previous incidents. But this time, the aftermath was different. Instead of awakening with no memory of his actions, he remained comatose for days, his vital signs fluctuating in patterns that suggested his brain was experiencing massive neural restructuring. When he finally regained consciousness, he seemed different in ways that his battle brothers could not precisely identify. His personality remained essentially unchanged, his loyalty and dedication to the chapter as strong as ever. But there were subtle alterations in his behavior that suggested fundamental changes in his perception of reality. He would sometimes respond to questions that had not been asked, as if hearing conversations that were taking place beyond normal human awareness. He displayed knowledge of events occurring in distant parts of the galaxy, information that should have been impossible for him to possess. Most disturbing were his references to conversations with individuals who were not present. He would occasionally pause in mid-sentence to listen to something that no one else could hear, then resume speaking as if responding to advice or instructions from an invisible advisor. When questioned about these behaviors, he claimed to be unaware of them, insisting that his battle brothers were mistaken about what they had observed. The medical examinations that followed revealed changes that had not been present after previous episodes. Brain scans showed increased activity in regions associated with psychic ability, but also unusual neural pathways that seemed to serve no identifiable function. Blood tests revealed genetic markers that matched no known space marine enhancement process, suggesting that his body was adapting to his condition in ways that exceeded the original scope of his modifications. Chief Librarian Tycho faced a decision that would determine not only Calistarius's fate, but also the chapter's approach to similar cases in the future. The evidence clearly indicated that the librarian's condition was worsening, his episodes becoming more frequent and more severe. Standard protocol demanded his immediate transfer to the Death Company, where his remaining years could be spent in honorable service until the Black Rage claimed him completely. But Calistarius represented something unprecedented in Blood Angel's history. His episodes were unlike any previous manifestation of the chapter's genetic curses, and his psychic abilities continued to function at exceptional levels between incidents. To simply write him off as another victim of the Black Rage would be to waste a potentially valuable resource and abandon any hope of understanding his unique condition. The compromise solution involved transferring Calistarius to the chapter's reclusium, where he would serve under the direct supervision of Chaplain Lemartes. The Death Company's spiritual leader possessed extensive experience with managing the symptoms of the Black Rage, and his own struggle with the curse might provide insights into Calistarius's situation. It was not a permanent assignment, but rather an evaluation period that would determine whether the librarian could continue in active service or would require more drastic intervention. The reclusium of the Blood Angels serves multiple functions within the chapter's organizational structure. It is simultaneously a place of worship, a training facility for chaplains, and a treatment center for those afflicted with the genetic curses that plague the sons of Sanguinius. Within its sacred halls, the chapter's spiritual leaders conduct the rituals and ceremonies that maintain the Blood Angels' connection to their Primarch, while also managing the psychological and physiological challenges that mark their genetic heritage. For Calistarius, assignment to the reclusium represented a form of exile disguised as medical treatment. He was no longer a fully trusted member of the chapter's command structure, his condition having marked him as potentially dangerous to his battle brothers. But neither was he condemned to the hopeless fury of the Death Company, his unique symptoms warranting careful study rather than immediate disposition among the lost and the damned. Chaplain Lamartes received him with the mixture of compassion and clinical detachment that marked all his interactions with cursed battle brothers. The Guardian of the Lost had himself wrestled with the Black Rage for over 2 centuries, his own condition held in check through a combination of mental discipline, pharmaceutical intervention, and pure force of will. If anyone could understand what Calistarius was experiencing, it would be the chaplain who had made the management of madness into a sacred duty. The initial evaluation process involved extensive interviews designed to map the progression of Calistarius's symptoms and identify potential triggers for his episodes. Lamartes approached the task with the methodical precision of a scholar, combined with the intuitive understanding of someone who had lived with similar afflictions. His questions probed not just the surface details of each incident, but the emotional and psychological states that preceded them. What emerged from these sessions was a pattern more complex than anyone had previously recognized. Calistarius's episodes were not random occurrences, but seemed to be triggered by specific combinations of psychic stress and emotional trauma. Situations that reminded him of past failures or unresolved conflicts were particularly dangerous, as were environments that contained strong psychic resonances or warp-tainted materials. More significantly, Lamartes discovered that Calistarius retained far more awareness during his episodes than had been previously suspected. While his actions suggested complete dissociation from reality, some part of his consciousness remained alert and observant, recording events that he could access through careful questioning under controlled conditions. It was as if his mind had developed a defense mechanism that allowed his core personality to survive while something else took control of his physical form. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Calistarius was conscious during his episodes but unable to control his actions, then his condition represented not madness in the traditional sense, but some form of psychic possession or external influence. The Black Rage typically manifested as an overwhelming flood of inherited memories that drowned the victim's individual consciousness. What Calistarius experienced seemed to involve the imposition of an entirely foreign awareness that used his body while keeping his mind imprisoned but intact. Lamartes initiated a series of experimental treatments designed to strengthen Calistarius's mental defenses and provide him with tools for resisting whatever force was attempting to control him. These sessions drew on techniques developed for training librarians to resist demonic possession, modified to account for the unique nature of his condition. Progress was slow and often frustrating, with apparent breakthroughs followed by setbacks that seemed to erase weeks of careful work. During this period, Calistarius participated in several Death Company operations, his assignment to the reclusium allowing him to serve alongside the chapter's most tragic warriors. These campaigns provided valuable opportunities to study his condition under combat conditions, while also giving him a chance to prove his continued worth to the chapter, despite his afflictions. The first of these operations took place on the world of Cygnus Prime, where a chaos cult had seized control of the planetary government and declared independence from imperial rule. The Death Company was deployed as part of a larger force intended to recapture key strategic positions and eliminate the heretical leadership. Calistarius's role was limited to providing psychic reconnaissance and maintaining communication with orbital assets, his condition requiring careful monitoring throughout the engagement. For the first phase of the operation, he performed admirably. His psychic senses provided early warning of ambushes and hidden defensive positions, while his tactical experience helped coordinate the Death Company's advance through the city's industrial district. His battle brothers began to show signs of renewed confidence in his abilities, their initial suspicion giving way to professional respect for his contributions to the mission. The change came when the Death Company encountered a shrine dedicated to one of the ruinous powers hidden in the basement of a commercial building. The psychic emanations from the blasphemous altar triggered an immediate response from every blood angel present, their genetic hatred of chaos overwhelming their tactical discipline. But for Calistarius, the effect was different and far more dramatic. Instead of joining his battle brothers in their assault on the shrine, he became completely motionless, his attention focused on something that existed beyond normal perception. When questioned by Chaplain Lamartis, he reported seeing visions of Sanguinius engaged in combat with entities that matched no known description of demons or other warp entities. The visions were incredibly detailed, including conversations and strategic discussions that seemed to be taking place in real time rather than being replayed from memory. Most disturbing was his claim that Sanguinius was aware of his presence during these visions and was attempting to communicate with him directly. According to Calistarius, the Primarch was trying to warn him about something that threatened not just the current mission, but the future of the entire chapter. The messages were fragmentary and difficult to interpret, delivered through symbolic imagery that required careful analysis to understand. Lamartis initially dismissed these reports as elaborate hallucinations, symptoms of his deteriorating condition rather than genuine mystical experiences. But as the visions continued and their content proved to be prophetically accurate about subsequent events in the campaign, the chaplain began to consider the possibility that Calistarius was experiencing something unprecedented in the chapter's history. The shrine operation concluded successfully, with the Death Company destroying the Chaos Altar and eliminating the cultists who had been conducting rituals there. But the victory came at a cost that extended beyond the casualties suffered during the assault. Calistarius's condition had clearly worsened, his episodes becoming more frequent and more intense. By the end of the deployment, he was experiencing visions almost continuously, his awareness split between the immediate tactical situation and whatever otherworldly realm his enhanced perception was accessing. Medical examination upon return to Baal revealed further changes in his neural patterns and brain chemistry. The regions of his brain associated with psychic ability were showing activity levels that should have been fatal to any normal space marine. His genetic markers indicated ongoing mutations that seemed to be pushing his physiology beyond the boundaries of what the Emperor's gene seed could sustain. Yet he remained functional, his personality intact despite the clearly pathological changes occurring in his body. Lamartis submitted a detailed report to Chapter Master Dante, outlining his observations and requesting guidance on how to proceed with Calistarius's case. The document represented months of careful analysis and represented the most comprehensive study of an atypical Black Rage manifestation in the chapter's recorded history. Its conclusions were both hopeful and deeply troubling. On the positive side, Calistarius had demonstrated that his condition could be managed sufficiently to allow continued service in combat roles. His psychic abilities remained intact and had in some ways been enhanced by his experiences. His loyalty to the chapter was unquestionable, and his tactical competence had not been significantly affected by his episodes. But the report also documented the progressive nature of his condition and the increasing severity of his symptoms. Lamartis predicted that without some form of intervention, Calistarius would eventually be lost to whatever force was influencing him, his consciousness finally overwhelmed by the alien awareness that seemed to be slowly claiming his mind. The question was whether the chapter possessed any means of preventing this outcome, or if they were simply documenting the stages of an unprecedented form of spiritual corruption. Chapter Master Dante reviewed the report personally, consulting with the chapter's most senior officers and spiritual advisors before making his decision. The consensus was that Calistarius represented both an opportunity and a threat that required careful management. His unique condition might provide insights into the nature of the Blood Angel's genetic curses, but it also posed risks that could affect the entire chapter if mishandled. The decision was made to continue Calistarius's assignment to the reclusium while implementing enhanced monitoring and support protocols. He would remain under Limartes's direct supervision, participating in selected operations while serving as a subject for ongoing research into his condition. It was not a permanent solution, but it would allow the chapter to gather more information while keeping him productive and engaged. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in the chapter's modern history. By allowing Calistarius to continue serving despite his obvious abnormalities, Dante set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately transform not just one troubled librarian, but the Blood Angels' understanding of their own nature and potential. The Third War for Armageddon began as a test of imperial resolve against the largest orc invasion in recorded history. Warlord Gazgakul, Mag Uruk Thraka, had returned to the world where his first great campaign had been defeated, bringing with him a war of unprecedented size and ferocity. Every available imperial force was called upon to defend the hive cities and industrial complexes that made Armageddon one of the Imperium's most strategically vital worlds. For the Blood Angels, the call to war came at a time when the chapter was already stretched thin by commitments across multiple sectors. Recent campaigns against Tyrannid splinter fleets and chaos incursions had depleted their strength, leaving many companies below optimal operational levels. But the strategic importance of Armageddon made their participation mandatory, regardless of their current readiness status. Chapter Master Dante made the difficult decision to commit the Death Company to the campaign, recognizing that their unique combat capabilities would be invaluable in the close quarters fighting that characterized urban warfare against orc forces. The lost and the damned could be trusted to fight with unmatched ferocity, their madness making them ideally suited for the kind of desperate battles that would determine Armageddon's fate. Chaplain Limartes commanded the Death Company deployment, bringing with him 37 cursed battle brothers whose madness had made them unsuitable for normal tactical operations. Among them was Brother Calistarius, his assignment to the unit reflecting both his deteriorating condition and the chapter's desperate need for every available psyker during the coming campaign. The Death Company was deployed to Hive Acheron, one of Armageddon's secondary population centers that had been cut off from the main Imperial forces by the Orc advance. Intelligence reports indicated that the Hive's defenders were holding out in isolated pockets, conducting a fighting withdrawal through the industrial sectors, while the Greenskins consolidated their control over the outer districts. The Death Company's mission was to link up with these defenders and coordinate a breakout operation that would allow the surviving population to evacuate to safer areas. The insertion was conducted via drop pod assault, a rapid deployment method that would allow the Death Company to strike directly at the heart of the Orc positions without fighting through their outer defenses. For most of the cursed battle brothers, the violent descent represented just another form of combat, their madness making them indifferent to the tactical complexities of the operation. But for Calistarius, the approach to Armageddon triggered visions of exceptional intensity and clarity. As his drop pod screamed through the planet's atmosphere, Calistarius experienced what he later described as a conversation with Sanguinius himself. The Primarch appeared to him not as a memory or hallucination, but as a conscious entity capable of independent thought and communication. The discussion covered topics that ranged from tactical advice for the coming battle to philosophical questions about the nature of duty and sacrifice. Most significantly, Sanguinius warned him that the events unfolding on Armageddon would represent a crucial turning point in his personal development. The Primarch spoke of a choice that would need to be made, a decision between embracing the madness that threatened to consume him or finding a way to transcend the limitations that had defined his existence. The consequences of this choice would affect not just Calistarius himself, but the future of the entire chapter. The landing zone was a vast foundry complex in Hive Acheron's industrial district, its towering smokestacks and processing facilities providing both cover and obstacles for the assault force. The Death Company's drop pods struck the factory floor with sufficient force to shatter the reinforced concrete, sending shockwaves through the surrounding structures that triggered secondary collapses and fires throughout the area. The Orcs responded to the insertion with typical aggression, launching immediate counterattacks designed to overwhelm the Blood Angels before they could establish defensive positions. The fighting was brutal even by Space Marine standards, with both sides committed to total victory regardless of casualties. The confined spaces of the factory complex favored close combat, exactly the kind of engagement where the Death Company's berserker fury could be most effectively applied. Calistarius fought alongside his cursed battle brothers with the mechanical precision that had always characterized his combat performance. His force weapon carved through orc flesh and crude armor with devastating effectiveness, while his psychic abilities provided tactical advantages that helped the Death Company maintain their momentum despite being vastly outnumbered. For the first few hours of combat, his performance was exemplary, but as the battle intensified and the Death Company pushed deeper into the foundry complex, Calistarius began to experience episodes of increasing severity. The visions that had marked his previous deployments became more frequent and more vivid, often lasting for several minutes at a time. During these episodes, he would continue fighting, but his tactics and targeting suggested that he was responding to threats that existed only in his altered perception. The situation reached a crisis point when the Death Company encountered the Orc war boss commanding the factory's defenses. Grokirk Scarjaw was a massive specimen, even by greenskin standards, his body enhanced with crude cybernetic implants that had been welded directly to his skeleton. He led his bodyguard of knobs in a frontal assault on the Blood Angels, his twin power claws crackling with energy as he carved a path through the industrial machinery that filled the foundry floor. The Death Company responded with their characteristic fury, surrounding the war boss and his retinue in a swirling melee that filled the air with the sound of weapons fire and screaming metal. Chaplain Lemates led the assault, his Crozius Arcanum blazing with holy light as he sought to reach the Orc leader and end the battle with a single decisive blow. It was during this climactic engagement that Calistarius experienced the most severe episode of his career. Instead of joining the assault on the war boss, he became completely motionless, his attention focused on something that no one else could perceive. When Lemates attempted to redirect his attention to the immediate threat, Calistarius began speaking in the unknown language that had marked his previous episodes, his words carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very structure of reality. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The air around Calistarius began to shimmer and distort, as if his presence was somehow affecting the fundamental properties of local space. Machinery throughout the foundry began to malfunction, their systems responding to interference that registered on no known spectrum. Most disturbing of all, the Orcs themselves seemed to be affected by whatever force was emanating from the possessed librarian. The Greenskins began to move with uncharacteristic coordination, their usual chaotic assault patterns replaced by tactical formations that displayed an understanding of Space Marine capabilities far beyond their normal intelligence. It was as if something was directing their actions, using them as instruments to achieve objectives that had nothing to do with their own territorial ambitions. Grokirk Scarjaw himself seemed to be under external control, his attacks focusing not on the Death Company warriors who posed the greatest immediate threat, but on specific structural elements of the foundry that served no obvious tactical purpose. He was systematically destroying support columns and power conduits, weakening the building's integrity in a pattern that suggested architectural knowledge rather than random violence. The realization that struck Lemates was both brilliant and horrifying. The Orc assault was not intended to defeat the Death Company through conventional combat, but to trigger a controlled collapse of the foundry that would bury both sides under thousands of tons of debris. Someone or something was manipulating the battle to achieve this specific outcome, using both the orcs and the Blood Angels as unknowing instruments in a larger design. The chaplain attempted to withdraw his forces from the danger zone, but the Death Company's madness made tactical disengagement nearly impossible. The cursed Battle Brothers were locked in combat with their hated enemies, their berserker fury making them deaf to orders that contradicted their desire to close with and destroy the Greenskins. Only direct physical intervention could break them away from their targets, and even then they fought against any attempt to prevent them from continuing the assault. Meanwhile, Calistarius remained motionless in the center of the melee, his psychic aura fluctuating wildly as whatever force controlled him continued its manipulation of the battle. The structural damage to the foundry was accelerating, with support beams beginning to buckle under loads they were never designed to bear. Secondary explosions from damaged equipment filled the air with toxic smoke and burning chemicals, further complicating the tactical situation. It was Brother Corbulo, the chapter's sanguinary high priest, who provided the key insight that allowed Lamartes to understand what was happening. Corbulo had arrived with a relief force just as the foundry began its final collapse, his medical expertise allowing him to recognize symptoms that others had missed. Calistarius was not simply experiencing another episode of the Black Rage, but was being used as a conduit for something that existed outside normal reality. The entity manipulating him possessed knowledge of orc psychology and tactical doctrine that suggested extensive study of Imperial combat methods. It understood how Space Marines would respond to specific situations, and was using that knowledge to engineer outcomes that served its own mysterious purposes. The collapse of the foundry was not an accident, but a carefully planned trap designed to eliminate both the Death Company and the Orc defenders, while concealing the true nature of the manipulation. Corbulo's arrival provided the psychic reinforcement necessary to disrupt whatever hold the entity had established over Calistarius. Working together, the High Priest and Chaplain Lamartes were able to penetrate the psychic interference that surrounded the possessed librarian and restore some measure of his normal consciousness. The process was agonizing for all involved, requiring them to make direct contact with the alien awareness that had claimed him while maintaining their own sanity against its influence. The entity's response to this interference was immediate and violent. Instead of simply withdrawing from Calistarius's mind, it began to pour more energy into its hold over him, attempting to complete whatever process it had been conducting through his physical form. The librarian's body began to change in ways that defied medical understanding, his flesh taking on qualities that suggested fundamental alterations to his genetic structure. But something unexpected happened during this final assault on Calistarius's consciousness. Instead of being overwhelmed by the alien presence, he began to fight back with resources that he had never previously accessed. His psychic defenses, strengthened by months of training under Lamart's guidance, proved capable of resisting the entity's control, while simultaneously analyzing its methods and motivations. For the first time since his episodes had begun, Calistarius retained full awareness and memory of what was happening to him. He could perceive the entity that had been manipulating him, understand its nature and objectives, and formulate a response that went beyond simple resistance. He was no longer a passive victim of possession, but an active participant in a psychic conflict that would determine his future and possibly that of his entire chapter. The battle that followed took place simultaneously on multiple levels of reality. In the physical world, the foundry's collapse continued with mechanical inevitability, thousands of tons of metal and concrete crashing down on the combatants below. But in the realm of psychic energy, Calistarius waged a private war against the entity that had tormented him for years, fighting for control of his own consciousness with weapons that existed only in the deepest levels of the warp. The conflict lasted only minutes in objective time, but subjectively it seemed to extend for hours or days. Calistarius experienced the full scope of the entity's knowledge and purpose, understanding for the first time the true nature of what had been happening to him. He was not simply a victim of the Black Rage or some random psychic phenomenon, but had been specifically selected and prepared for a role in events that stretched far beyond his individual fate. When the psychic battle reached its conclusion, the change in Calistarius was immediately apparent to everyone present. The confused and tormented librarian who had entered the foundry was gone, replaced by something that retained his memories and personality, but possessed capabilities that exceeded anything he had previously demonstrated. He stood amid the collapsing building with complete calm, his enhanced awareness allowing him to perceive safe routes through the falling debris that normal human senses could never have detected. More significantly, his psychic abilities had been transformed by his confrontation with the entity. Where once his powers had been crude and uncontrolled, they now displayed precision and sophistication that rivaled the most experienced epistolaries. He could manipulate matter and energy with thought alone, reshape local reality according to his will, and perceive events occurring across vast distances of space and time. But the greatest change was in his relationship with the Blood Angel's genetic heritage. The Red Thirst and the Black Rage, which had tormented him for years, no longer held any power over his consciousness. He had somehow transcended the limitations that defined his chapter's existence, achieving a state of mental and spiritual development that none of his battle brothers had ever attained. The foundry's collapse, which should have killed everyone present, instead became a testament to Calistarius's transformation. Using his enhanced abilities, he created a protective barrier that shielded the surviving Death Company members from the falling debris, while simultaneously opening escape routes through the wreckage. The operation that had seemed doomed to end in disaster instead concluded with the successful evacuation of all Imperial personnel and the elimination of the Orc threat. When the rescue teams finally reached the foundry site, they found the Death Company standing amid the ruins in perfect formation, their weapons ready, and their discipline intact despite the traumatic events they had endured. At their center stood Calistarius, no longer the confused and tormented librarian who had descended to Armageddon, but something new and unprecedented in the Imperium's long history. The transformation was complete, but its full implications would not become apparent until much later. Calistarius had died in the depths of the foundry, destroyed by forces that exceeded his ability to resist. What emerged from the wreckage was Lord Mephiston, a being that possessed the memories and loyalties of the original librarian, but capabilities that transcended the normal boundaries of Space Marine existence. The return to Baal following the Armageddon campaign marked the beginning of a new chapter in both the individual destiny of the being who had once been Calistarius and the collective history of the Blood Angels chapter. The transformation that had occurred in the depths of the foundry represented something unprecedented in the Imperium's records, a fundamental change that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of Space Marine physiology and the limitations of human potential. Chapter Master Dante received the initial reports of Calistarius's transformation with a mixture of hope and profound concern. The accounts provided by Chaplain Lematis and High Priest Corbulo described abilities that seemed to exceed anything previously documented in Imperial archives, capabilities that suggested the transformed librarian had somehow transcended the genetic limitations that bound all of the Emperor's Space Marines. The potential benefits were obvious. A being capable of resisting the Blood Angel's genetic curses while maintaining full access to exceptional psychic abilities would represent an invaluable asset to the chapter. If Calistarius's condition could be studied and understood, it might lead to treatments that could free other battle brothers from the Red Thirst and Black Rage that had claimed so many over the millennia. But the risks were equally apparent. The transformation had occurred through contact with entities and forces that remained poorly understood. processes that might represent forms of corruption or mutation that could threaten the chapter's genetic purity. The being who called himself Mephiston retained the memories and apparent loyalties of the original librarian, but there was no guarantee that these qualities would persist as his condition continued to evolve. The initial medical examinations conducted upon his return to Baal revealed changes that defied easy classification. Mephiston's genetic structure remained recognizably that of a space marine enhanced with Blood Angel's gene seed, but the expression of various traits had been altered in ways that suggested ongoing mutation or adaptation. His psychic potential had increased exponentially, his power ratings climbing to levels that should have been impossible for any individual to safely channel. More disturbing were the psychological evaluations, which revealed patterns of thought and perception that differed significantly from baseline space marine norms. Mephiston's consciousness seemed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously, processing information from sources that conventional testing could not identify or measure. He demonstrated knowledge of events occurring in distant parts of the galaxy, awareness of strategic situations that should have been beyond his clearance level to access. When questioned about these capabilities, Mephiston claimed that his transformation had granted him access to what he termed the blood of the galaxy, a cosmic awareness that allowed him to perceive the connections between all living beings descended from ancient Terran stock. Through this enhanced perception, he could observe events affecting humanity across vast distances of space and time. Though the information came to him in symbolic or metaphorical forms that required careful interpretation, the theological implications of these claims were staggering. If Mephiston's descriptions were accurate, his transformation had somehow connected him to the collective unconscious of the human species, granting him access to a form of racial memory that encompassed the entire history of mankind's expansion across the galaxy. Such capabilities would make him not just a powerful psyker, but a living link to the Emperor's original vision for humanity's destiny. Chief Librarian Malakim Foros conducted extensive interviews with Mephiston, attempting to map the scope of his new abilities and understand the mechanisms that made them possible. These sessions revealed that the transformation had affected not just his psychic capabilities, but his fundamental understanding of reality itself. Mephiston spoke of perceiving the universe as a vast web of interconnected energy patterns, with each living being representing a node in a cosmic network of consciousness. According to his accounts, the entity that had possessed him during his years of episodes had been attempting to access this network for its own purposes, using his psychic abilities as a gateway to influence events across multiple star systems. The transformation had occurred when he finally gained sufficient understanding to resist this manipulation and claim control of the connection for himself, turning what had been a vulnerability into a source of unprecedented power. The political ramifications of Mephiston's emergence extended far beyond the Blood Angels chapter. Word of the transformation quickly spread through the highest levels of imperial administration, reaching the attention of the Inquisition and other organizations concerned with monitoring genetic purity and psychic phenomena. Several formal investigations were initiated to determine whether Mephiston represented a valuable asset or a potential threat to imperial security. Inquisitor Fyodor Karamazov of the Ordo Hereticus arrived on Baal within weeks of the initial reports, his mandate authorizing him to conduct whatever examinations he deemed necessary to assess the nature and implications of Mephiston's condition. The Inquisitor's reputation for thoroughness was matched only by his willingness to take extreme measures when dealing with suspected corruption or mutation, making his investigation a potential death sentence for the transformed librarian. The examination process lasted for months, during which Mephiston was subjected to every test and procedure that imperial science could devise. His genetic structure was analyzed at the molecular level, his psychic abilities measured and catalogued, his memories probed for signs of corruption or external influence. Throughout the ordeal, he cooperated fully with his interrogators, answering their questions with patience and providing demonstrations of his capabilities when requested. The results were inconclusive in many respects, but they provided enough evidence to convince Karamazov that Mephiston represented a genuine evolution rather than a form of corruption. His genetic markers remained consistent with pure Blood Angel stock, showing no signs of the mutations that typically accompanied Chaos Taint or Xeno's influence. His psychic abilities, while exceptional in scope, operated according to principles that were recognizably human rather than alien in origin. Most importantly, his loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium appeared to be genuine and unwavering. Under conditions that would have broken most subjects, Mephiston continued to express absolute dedication to humanity's cause and complete acceptance of imperial authority. His transformation had not altered his fundamental values or motivations, only enhanced his ability to serve them effectively. Karamazov's final report to the Holy Ordos recommended continued monitoring of Mephiston's condition while allowing him to return to active duty with the Blood Angels. The Inquisitor's conclusion was that the transformed librarian represented a valuable asset whose capabilities outweighed the potential risks associated with his unique status. However, he also recommended the establishment of permanent oversight protocols to ensure that any future changes in Mephiston's condition would be detected and evaluated immediately. Chapter Master Dante accepted these conditions, recognizing that they represented the best possible outcome under the circumstances. Mephiston would be allowed to continue serving the chapter, but his activities would be subject to ongoing scrutiny by outside authorities whose primary concern was the security of the Imperium rather than the welfare of individual space marines. The transformed librarian's first assignment following his return to active duty was to serve as chief librarian of the Blood Angels, replacing Malakim Foros, who had been killed during a campaign against Tyrannid splinter fleets. The promotion reflected both recognition of his enhanced capabilities and the practical need to place someone of his power in a position where he could be effectively monitored by the chapter's leadership. Mephiston approached his new responsibilities with the same methodical precision that had characterized his service as Brother Calistarius, but enhanced by capabilities that allowed him to serve his chapter in ways that had never before been possible. His enhanced awareness provided early warning of threats developing across the Blood Angels' operational area, while his expanded psychic abilities allowed him to coordinate with Imperial forces across vast distances of space. His first major test came during the defense of the Bile system against a massive Tyrannid invasion, when Hive Fleet Leviathan launched a three-pronged assault on the Blood Angels' home worlds. The swarm's approach had been detected months in advance, but the scale of the threat exceeded anything the chapter had previously faced. Every available battle brother was recalled to defend their ancestral home, but even their combined strength seemed insufficient to stop the alien tide. Mephiston's contribution to the defense went far beyond conventional military tactics. Using his enhanced perception, he was able to identify the synaptic creatures that coordinated the Tyrannid assault and target them for elimination by specially equipped strike teams. His psychic abilities allowed him to disrupt the psychic networks that the aliens used for communication, creating confusion and disorder within their normally perfectly coordinated formations. Most significantly, his connection to what he termed the blood of the galaxy enabled him to coordinate defensive efforts across multiple star systems simultaneously. He could perceive the overall pattern of the Tyrannid assault and redirect Imperial forces to meet threats that had not yet materialized, effectively fighting the aliens with a level of strategic awareness that matched their own collective intelligence. The campaign lasted for over a year, with battles ranging from void combat in the outer system to desperate last stands in the streets of Bail Secundus. Throughout the conflict, Mephiston's abilities proved crucial to the chapter's survival, his interventions often providing the margin of victory in engagements that would otherwise have resulted in catastrophic defeat. But it was during the final phases of the invasion, when the Tyranids had been driven back but not completely eliminated, that Mephiston demonstrated the true extent of his transformation. A splinter of Hive Fleet Leviathan had established a foothold on Baal Prime itself, threatening to overrun the ancient crypts where the chapter's most sacred relics were housed. The assault on the alien positions required precision beyond the capabilities of conventional forces. The Tyranids had adapted to the Blood Angels' tactical doctrines, developing countermeasures that neutralized most of their standard weapons and strategies. Victory would require something unexpected, a form of warfare that the aliens could not predict or prepare for. Mephiston provided that advantage through a demonstration of power that redefined the possible scope of individual action in warfare. Using abilities that he had never previously revealed, he began to systematically dismantle the Tyranid presence on Baal Prime through direct psychic manipulation of matter and energy. Alien bioforms simply ceased to exist under the focus of his attention, their complex cellular structures unraveling at the molecular level. The process was not violent in any conventional sense. There were no explosions or energy discharges, no visible effects that would register on standard battlefield sensors. The Tyranids simply stopped being, their matter dispersing into component elements that were then absorbed into the planet's ecosystem. Within hours, a force that had threatened to overrun the chapter's homeworld had been completely eliminated without leaving any trace of its previous existence. The implications of this demonstration were staggering. Mephiston had displayed capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial records, abilities that suggested he had somehow transcended the normal limitations of psychic power. He was no longer simply an enhanced space marine, but something that operated according to principles that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of reality. Yet throughout the demonstration, he remained recognizably himself, motivated by the same loyalties and values that had defined his service as Brother Calistarius. His transformation had not altered his essential character, only enhanced his ability to serve the Emperor and protect his battle brothers. He was still a blood angel, but one who had somehow overcome the limitations that bound all others of his kind. The victory on Baal Prime marked the beginning of Mephiston's emergence as a figure of galactic significance. Word of his abilities spread throughout the Imperium, reaching the attention of military commanders and political leaders who recognized the strategic value of someone capable of such extraordinary feats. Requests for his services began arriving from across Imperial space, each one representing conflicts where his unique capabilities might provide the margin of victory. But with recognition came increased scrutiny. The Inquisition maintained its oversight protocols, while various factions within the imperial hierarchy began to develop their own plans for utilizing or controlling the Lord of Death. Mephiston found himself at the center of political calculations that extended far beyond the traditional concerns of a chapter librarian, his very existence representing a new variable in the complex equations that governed imperial strategy. The Lord of Death Ascendant, the decades following the defeat of Hive Fleet Leviathan, saw Mephiston's evolution from a chapter asset to a figure of galactic importance, whose influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of space marine operations. His unique capabilities and unprecedented resistance to the Blood Angels' genetic curses made him a valuable ally for Imperial forces across multiple sectors, while his growing reputation attracted both admiration and suspicion from the highest levels of Imperial authority. His official title during this period was Chief Librarian of the Blood Angels, a position that theoretically limited his responsibilities to the chapter's internal affairs and immediate operational requirements. But in practice, Mephiston's activities ranged across dozens of star systems, his interventions often proving decisive in conflicts that would otherwise have resulted in significant Imperial defeats. The scope of his influence became apparent during the Macarian Crusade's final phases, when remnants of the Great Expedition found themselves trapped in the galactic north by a combination of orc incursions and chaos uprisings. Multiple Imperial Guard regiments and several Space Marine companies were cut off from supply lines and reinforcements, facing annihilation unless substantial relief forces could be organized and deployed within weeks rather than months. Traditional Imperial response protocols would have required extensive planning and resource allocation, processes that would take months to complete and might arrive too late to affect the outcome. But Mephiston's enhanced perception allowed him to identify strategic opportunities that conventional analysis had missed, while his psychic abilities enabled him to coordinate relief efforts across distances that would have made normal communication impossible. Working in concert with Lord Commander Solar Macarius himself, Mephiston orchestrated a series of simultaneous strikes that shattered the enemy coalitions and opened corridors for the trapped Imperial forces to withdraw. The operation required precise timing across dozens of engagements, coordination that would have been impossible without his ability to perceive and influence events occurring thousands of light-years apart. The success of the Macharian intervention established Mephiston's reputation as someone whose capabilities transcended traditional military categories. He was no longer simply a powerful psyker or an exceptional space marine, but a strategic asset whose involvement could alter the outcome of entire campaigns. Requests for his services began arriving from across the Imperium, each one representing conflicts where his unique abilities might provide the decisive advantage. But with increased prominence came increased scrutiny from organizations whose primary concern was maintaining the stability and orthodoxy of Imperial institutions. The Adeptus Mechanicus began conducting detailed studies of Mephiston's abilities, attempting to understand the mechanisms that made his transformation possible. The Adeptus Ministorum initiated theological investigations to determine whether his condition represented divine blessing or dangerous deviation from human norms. Most significantly, the High Lords of Terror themselves began to take notice of the being who had somehow transcended the limitations that bound all other servants of the Emperor. Secret deliberations were held to determine whether Mephiston represented an asset to be cultivated or a threat to be contained, with different factions within the Imperial hierarchy reaching conflicting conclusions about his ultimate significance. These political complications were temporarily set aside when reports arrived of a new threat developing in the Segmentum Tempestus. A chaos warband calling itself the Crimson Path had emerged from the Eye of Terror, leading a coalition of traitor space marines and demon engines in assaults on several Imperial worlds. Their tactics suggested coordination and intelligence that exceeded normal chaos capabilities, while their apparent objectives seemed designed to destabilize entire subsectors rather than simply claiming territory or resources. Initial Imperial response efforts had met with limited success. The Crimson Path seemed capable of anticipating and countering every strategy employed against them, their leaders displaying knowledge of Imperial doctrine and capabilities that suggested extensive infiltration of Imperial command structures. Several regiments of Imperial Guard had been destroyed in what appeared to be carefully planned ambushes, while 2 Space Marine companies had suffered severe casualties during operations that should have been routine. Analysis of the enemy's behavioral patterns suggested that they were being guided by intelligence that operated on a strategic level far above normal chaos warbands. Someone or something was providing them with detailed information about Imperial defensive preparations and troop movements, allowing them to strike at weak points while avoiding areas where they might face effective resistance. Chapter Master Dante authorized Mephiston's deployment to the affected region, recognizing that the situation required capabilities beyond those possessed by conventional Imperial forces. The Lord of Death's enhanced perception might allow him to identify the source of the enemy's intelligence advantage, while his psychic abilities could potentially disrupt whatever communication methods they were using to coordinate their operations. The campaign that followed would become one of the defining conflicts of Mephiston's career. a struggle that tested not only his enhanced abilities, but also his understanding of his own nature and purpose. The Crimson Path proved to be more than simply another chaos warband seeking to expand their influence through conventional warfare. They were instruments of something far more ancient and dangerous, entities whose plans extended across millennia and encompassed objectives that threatened the fundamental structure of reality itself. Mephiston's first encounter with the enemy occurred on the world of Vanita Prime, where Crimson Path forces had established a stronghold in the planet's primary hive city. Imperial forces had been conducting a siege for weeks without making significant progress, their attacks consistently anticipated and countered by defenders who seemed to possess perfect knowledge of Imperial tactical doctrine. The Lord of Death's arrival changed the nature of the conflict immediately. Using his enhanced perception, he was able to identify the psychic emanations that marked the enemy's command structure, locating key leaders and communication nodes that had remained hidden from conventional reconnaissance. His initial strikes eliminated several high-value targets and disrupted the coordination that had made the Chaos forces so effective. But the enemy's response revealed the true scope of what the Imperial forces were facing. Instead of the confusion and disorganization that should have followed the destruction of their command structure, the Crimson Path forces began operating with even greater efficiency. Their attacks became more precise and devastating, their defensive preparations more sophisticated, as if the loss of their leaders had somehow enhanced rather than degraded their capabilities. The explanation became apparent when Mephiston's enhanced awareness detected the presence of something that should not have been able to exist in normal space. Deep within the Hive City's foundations, something ancient and malevolent was orchestrating the enemy's operations, its consciousness spanning multiple dimensions, and its knowledge encompassing secrets that predated the Imperium itself. The entity was not simply directing the Crimson Path's military operations, but was using them as instruments in a larger design that involved the systematic corruption of Imperial worlds across the entire subsector. Each victory by the Chaos forces weakened the barriers that separated real space from the warp, creating conditions that would eventually allow the entity to manifest physically and begin the next phase of its millennia-spanning plan. Recognizing the true nature of the threat, Mephiston realized that conventional military victories would be insufficient to resolve the crisis. The Crimson Path forces were expendable components in a larger mechanism, their destruction ultimately irrelevant as long as the entity controlling them remained active. The only way to end the conflict would be to confront the ancient intelligence directly, engaging it in the kind of psychic combat that few beings in the galaxy possessed the capability to survive. The descent into the Hive City's depths took Mephiston through layers of history that stretched back to the original human colonization of Vanita Prime. The architecture became progressively more ancient as he moved downward, eventually revealing structures that predated the Age of Strife, and possibly even the Dark Age of technology. At the deepest levels, he found chambers that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, their geometry following principles that human mathematics could not adequately describe. The entity that awaited him in these forbidden depths was unlike anything he had previously encountered. It possessed knowledge and power that dwarfed even the most ancient demons, its consciousness existing across multiple layers of reality simultaneously. When it spoke, its words carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the fundamental structure of existence itself, threatening to unravel the basic concepts that allowed rational thought to function. The being identified itself as one of the original architects of reality, a survivor from the epoch that preceded the current universe's creation. It had watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations, manipulating their development according to designs that encompassed cosmic cycles measured in millions of years. The Imperium of Man was simply its latest project, an experiment in controlled evolution that would eventually produce the conditions necessary for its complete manifestation in physical form. According to the entity's revelations, Mephiston's own transformation had been part of this larger plan. His exposure to its influence during his years of episodes had been carefully calculated to produce the specific capabilities he now possessed, abilities that would be necessary for the role he was intended to play in the coming culmination of the cosmic design. He had not overcome the entity's control, but had instead been shaped by it into the perfect instrument for its ultimate objectives. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating. Everything that Mephiston believed about his transformation, his enhanced abilities, and his transcendence of the Blood Angel's genetic curses was revealed to be illusion. He was not a being who had overcome limitation through force of will, but a puppet whose strings were held by an intelligence that operated on scales of time and space that made human comprehension impossible. But the entity had underestimated the changes that had occurred in Mephiston's consciousness during his years of growth and development. The being it had shaped to serve its purposes had evolved beyond the original design, developing loyalties and motivations that transcended the parameters of its initial programming. The Lord of Death retained the capabilities that the entity had granted him, but he now understood how to turn those abilities against their original source. The psychic battle that followed took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with reality itself serving as the battlefield for a conflict between irreconcilable visions of existence. The ancient entity sought to impose its will through sheer power, drawing on resources accumulated over cosmic ages to overwhelm Mephiston's defenses. But the Lord of Death possessed something that his opponent had never encountered: the focused determination of a being who had chosen his own purpose rather than having it imposed upon him. The struggle extended for what seemed like eternities, though objective time measurements became meaningless in the distorted space where their conflict was taking place. Mephiston found himself fighting not just for his own existence, but for the fundamental right of conscious beings to determine their own destinies, rather than serving as components in designs they could never comprehend. Victory came not through superior power, but through superior understanding. Mephiston realized that the entity's greatest strength was also its most significant weakness. Its vast knowledge and cosmic perspective made it incapable of comprehending the simple human concepts of choice and self-sacrifice that gave meaning to existence on individual scales. It could manipulate cosmic forces and reshape reality according to its will, but it could not understand why anyone would choose struggle over surrender, suffering over certainty. Using this insight, Mephiston was able to turn the entity's own power against it, reflecting its attacks back through the same mechanisms it used to maintain its existence across multiple dimensions. The ancient being found itself trapped by the logical contradictions of its own design, its consciousness fragmenting as it tried to impose order on concepts that inherently defied its understanding. The destruction of the entity sent shockwaves through the warp that were felt across multiple star systems, its death cry marking the end of manipulations that had influenced galactic history for millennia. The Crimson Path forces collapsed immediately, their coordination shattered and their purpose dissolved. Within hours, Imperial forces had reclaimed Vanita Prime and begun the process of purging the remaining traces of chaos influence from the subsector. But the victory came at a significant cost to Mephiston himself. His battle with the ancient entity had required him to access the deepest levels of his enhanced abilities, pushing his consciousness to limits that even his transformed physiology struggled to sustain. When he finally emerged from the depths of the Hive City, his fellow Blood Angels found him changed in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion or injury. The Lord of Death had gained a new understanding of his own nature and the true scope of the cosmic forces that shaped galactic civilization. He now knew that his transformation had been part of a larger pattern, one element in designs that encompassed the entire history of human expansion across the galaxy. But he also understood that he possessed the power to reshape those patterns according to his own vision rather than serving purposes imposed by others. This knowledge would define the next phase of his existence as he struggled to balance his enhanced capabilities with the responsibilities they entailed. He was no longer simply a space marine serving his chapter, but a conscious agent in cosmic processes that would determine the future of human civilization itself. The choices he made would echo across centuries, their consequences affecting not just the Blood Angels, but the entire Imperium, and possibly the fate of consciousness itself in the galaxy. The aftermath of the Vanita Prime campaign marked a fundamental turning point in Mephiston's understanding of his place in the cosmic order. The revelations concerning the ancient entity's manipulation of his transformation had shattered many of his previous assumptions about the nature of his abilities and the source of his enhanced consciousness. But they had also provided him with knowledge that would prove crucial for navigating the challenges that lay ahead. His return to Baal was met with a mixture of celebration and concern from his fellow Blood Angels. The victory against the Crimson Path had eliminated a significant threat to Imperial security while demonstrating the strategic value of Mephiston's unique capabilities. But his battle brothers could not help but notice the changes that the conflict had wrought in their chief librarian. Alterations that went beyond simple combat fatigue or psychic exhaustion. Mephiston's presence now carried a weight that affected everyone around him, a sense of depth and complexity that suggested vast reservoirs of knowledge and experience. When he spoke, his words seemed to carry harmonics that resonated with concepts beyond normal human comprehension. His gaze, always intense, now seemed to perceive layers of reality that remained invisible to others. Chapter Master Dante conducted extensive debriefings with Mephiston following his return, attempting to understand both the tactical details of the Vanita campaign and its broader implications for the chapter's future operations. These conversations revealed that the Lord of Death had gained insights into the fundamental nature of the Blood Angels' genetic heritage, knowledge that might eventually lead to solutions for the curses that had plagued the chapter for millennia. According to Mephiston's analysis, the Red Thirst and Black Rage were not simply genetic flaws inherited from Sanguinius, but were actually defensive mechanisms designed to protect the Blood Angels from external manipulation. The ancient entity on Vanita Prime had revealed that numerous cosmic forces had attempted to influence the chapter's development over the centuries, seeking to use them as instruments for various purposes. The genetic instabilities that manifested as madness and bloodlust were actually psychic immune responses that prevented such manipulation from taking hold. This understanding suggested that Mephiston's own transcendence of these curses had not been achieved through willpower alone, but had required him to develop alternative defense mechanisms that could protect his consciousness without the destructive side effects that marked normal Blood Angel's physiology. His transformation had essentially evolved him beyond the need for the crude but effective protections that the gene seed provided, allowing him to maintain his independence while accessing capabilities that exceeded normal space marine limitations. The implications for the chapter as a whole were staggering. If Mephiston's analysis was correct, it might be possible to develop treatments that could grant other Blood Angels similar resistance to external manipulation without condemning them to eventual madness. The process would be dangerous and might not succeed for every individual, but even partial success could transform the chapter's operational capabilities and strategic value to the Imperium. But such developments would require time and resources that the Blood Angels could barely spare from their existing commitments. The galaxy burned with countless conflicts that demanded immediate attention, and the chapter's strength was already stretched thin across multiple war zones. Mephiston's unique abilities made him invaluable for resolving the most critical threats. But this same value meant that he was constantly being deployed to new battlefields, rather than having time to pursue research into his condition. The solution came from an unexpected source when representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus approached Chapter Master Dante with a proposal for joint research into Mephiston's transformation. The tech priests had been studying reports of his abilities for years, their interest piqued by the unprecedented nature of his evolution. They possessed resources and expertise that could accelerate any investigation into the mechanisms behind his transformation, while the Blood Angels could provide access to the subject himself and detailed records of his development. The arrangement that emerged from these negotiations represented a careful balance between the chapter's need for autonomy and the Mechanicus's desire for knowledge. Mephiston would spend portions of his time working with tech priest researchers, submitting to examinations and tests designed to map his enhanced capabilities. In exchange, the Mechanicus would provide technical support for developing treatments that might help other Blood Angels achieve similar transcendence of their genetic limitations. The research facility established for this purpose was located on Baal Secundus, constructed according to Mechanicus specifications, but under Blood Angel security protocols. The most advanced sensor equipment and analytical systems available to Imperial science were installed in underground chambers that could shield sensitive experiments from external interference. Teams of tech priests worked alongside chapter apothecaries and librarians. Their combined expertise focused on understanding phenomena that had never before been documented in Imperial records. The initial phase of research concentrated on mapping the physical changes that had occurred in Mephiston's body during his transformation. Advanced medical scanners revealed alterations to his genetic structure that went far beyond normal space marine enhancements, modifications that seemed to optimize his cellular functions for channeling psychic energy. His neural pathways had been completely restructured, creating connections that allowed his consciousness to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. More intriguing were the discoveries concerning his relationship with the warp itself. Normal psychers accessed psychic energy by creating temporary rifts in the boundary between real space and the immaterium, drawing power through controlled breaches that carried inherent risks of corruption or possession. But Mephiston's abilities seemed to operate through a fundamentally different mechanism, one that allowed him to manipulate warp energy without creating the vulnerabilities that made other psychers susceptible to demonic influence. The tech priests theorized that his transformation had somehow created a permanent but stable connection to specific layers of the warp, regions that contained pure psychic energy without the chaotic influences that characterized most of the immaterium. This connection explained both his immunity to chaos corruption and his ability to channel power levels that would destroy normal psychers, since he was drawing from sources that were inherently safe, rather than struggling to filter dangerous energies through inadequate defenses. But understanding the mechanisms behind Mephiston's abilities proved to be far easier than replicating them in other subjects. Early attempts to induce similar transformations in volunteer Blood Angels resulted in catastrophic failures that claimed the lives of several battle brothers despite the most careful preparation and monitoring. The process seemed to require specific preconditions that could not be artificially created, circumstances that had aligned perfectly in Mephiston's case, but might never occur again naturally. The breakthrough came when researchers discovered that Mephiston's transformation had been triggered not by external manipulation, but by his own psychic resistance to that manipulation. The ancient entity that had attempted to control him had inadvertently created the conditions necessary for his evolution by forcing his consciousness to develop defense mechanisms that exceeded normal human capabilities. The key was not the entity's influence itself, but Mephiston's rejection of that influence and his determination to maintain his independence. This insight suggested that successful transformation required not just psychic ability, but also specific psychological conditions that would motivate an individual to resist external control even at the cost of their own existence. The volunteers who had died in early experiments had possessed adequate psychic potential, but lacked the fundamental character traits that would drive them to choose transcendence over submission when faced with overwhelming pressure. The research team began developing screening procedures designed to identify blood angels who possessed both the necessary psychic sensitivity and the psychological profiles that might allow them to survive the transformation process. The criteria were extremely stringent, requiring candidates who combined exceptional mental discipline with the kind of stubborn independence that often put them at odds with traditional military hierarchy. Over the course of several years, only 3 individuals were identified as potential candidates for the experimental procedure. Each represented a different aspect of the psychological profile that the researchers believed was necessary for success. Brother Raufin possessed the psychic sensitivity and mental flexibility required for the initial stages of transformation. Sergeant Castor had demonstrated the kind of moral certainty that might allow him to resist external influence. Epistolary Tigurius brought tactical intelligence and strategic thinking that could help him navigate the complex psychological challenges that the process would entail. The decision to proceed with experimental transformations was not made lightly. Chapter Master Dante consulted with his most trusted advisors, weighing the potential benefits against the risks of losing experienced battle brothers in pursuit of uncertain advantages. The memory of the failed early experiments weighed heavily on everyone involved, a reminder that even the most careful preparation could not guarantee success. Mephiston himself argued strongly in favor of continuing the research, despite his personal awareness of the costs involved. His enhanced perception allowed him to see threats developing across the galaxy that would require capabilities beyond those possessed by normal space marines. The Imperium faced challenges that were growing in scope and complexity, enemies whose power exceeded anything in recorded history. If the Blood Angels were to continue serving effectively in such conflicts, they would need every advantage that could be obtained through careful application of knowledge and resources. The first experimental transformation was conducted with Brother Raufin, whose psychic potential most closely matched the conditions that had existed in Mephiston's original case. The procedure involved exposing the volunteer to carefully controlled psychic stimuli, designed to trigger the same kind of defensive response that had initiated Mephiston's evolution. Every aspect of the process was monitored by teams of specialists, their equipment recording biological and psychic data that would guide future attempts. For the first several hours, Raufin's responses followed the predicted patterns. His psychic defenses activated correctly. His consciousness began developing the layered structure that characterized Mephiston's transformed awareness, and his physiological signs indicated that his body was adapting to the enhanced energy flows required for advanced psychic manipulation. The research team began to feel cautiously optimistic that they were witnessing the first successful replication of Mephiston's transformation. But the process stalled during the crucial transition phase, when Raufin's consciousness should have achieved the breakthrough that would grant him independence from external psychic influence. Instead of transcending his limitations, he became trapped in a state of partial transformation that left him vulnerable to the very forces he was meant to resist. His awareness fragmented into multiple competing aspects, each one responding to different stimuli and pulling his actions in contradictory directions. The intervention required to save Raufin's life and sanity was swift but devastating. Mephiston was forced to use his own abilities to forcibly stabilize his battle brother's consciousness, essentially overriding the failed transformation and returning him to his original state. The process left Raufin alive but permanently changed, his psychic potential severely reduced, and his memory of the experience completely erased. The failure provided crucial data about the transformation process, but it also highlighted the enormous risks involved in attempting to replicate Mephiston's evolution. The researchers realized that they had underestimated the psychological component of the change. focusing too heavily on the technical aspects while neglecting the spiritual and emotional elements that had driven Mephiston's original breakthrough. Further research revealed that the transformation was not simply a matter of developing enhanced psychic abilities, but involved a fundamental redefinition of the subject's relationship with their own identity and purpose. Mephiston had succeeded because his battle against external control had forced him to clarify his own values and motivations, creating a core of certainty that could resist any attempt at manipulation. The volunteers who failed lacked this kind of absolute commitment to their own autonomous existence, making them vulnerable to the very forces that the transformation was meant to protect against. This understanding led to a revision of the entire research program. Instead of focusing on replicating the technical aspects of Mephiston's transformation, the team began developing procedures designed to help volunteers achieve the psychological clarity that seemed to be the crucial prerequisite for success. The process became less about physical modification and more about spiritual development, requiring candidates to undergo extensive meditation and self-examination before attempting any actual transformation. The second experimental subject, Sergeant Castor, underwent months of preparatory training designed to strengthen his sense of individual purpose and personal autonomy. The process involved controlled exposure to various forms of psychological pressure, each one intended to test his ability to maintain his core identity under extreme stress. Only when he had demonstrated complete resistance to external influence would he be permitted to attempt the actual transformation. When the procedure was finally conducted, the results were dramatically different from the previous attempt. Castor's transformation proceeded smoothly through all the critical phases, his consciousness successfully developing the layered structure that characterized advanced psychic awareness. His physiological adaptation occurred without the dangerous instabilities that had marked earlier experiments, suggesting that the psychological preparation had indeed been the missing element in previous attempts. The transformation was successful, but the results differed significantly from Mephiston's original evolution. Instead of developing the same broad-spectrum abilities that characterized the Lord of Death's powers, Castor's enhancement focused on specific areas that reflected his individual personality and interests. His psychic abilities remained relatively modest, but his resistance to external influence became absolute, making him immune to fear, doubt, and other psychological weapons that could affect normal space marines. The success of Castor's transformation provided proof that Mephiston's evolution could be replicated under the right conditions, but it also demonstrated that each individual's transformation would be unique to their own character and capabilities. There would be no standard procedure for creating enhanced blood angels, but rather a personalized approach that took into account the specific strengths and limitations of each candidate. The third experimental subject, Epistolary Tigurius, underwent a modified version of the procedure that was tailored to his particular psychological profile and psychic capabilities. His transformation proved to be the most successful of the experimental series, granting him abilities that complemented Mephiston's own powers while remaining distinctly different in their application and scope. With 3 successful transformations completed, the research program had achieved its primary objective of demonstrating that Mephiston's evolution was not a unique occurrence, but a reproducible process that could be applied to other suitable candidates. The techniques developed during the research would allow the Blood Angels to selectively enhance their most promising warriors, creating a cadre of individuals who possessed capabilities that exceeded normal Space Marine limitations. But the program also revealed the enormous challenges involved in identifying and preparing suitable candidates for transformation. The psychological requirements were extremely demanding, eliminating the vast majority of potential subjects before they could even begin the preparatory training. Of the hundreds of Blood Angels who were initially screened, only a handful possessed the combination of traits that might allow them to survive the transformation process. This limitation meant that enhanced blood angels would always represent a small elite within the chapter, individuals whose unique capabilities would make them invaluable for specific missions, but who could never replace the normal battle brothers who formed the backbone of the chapter's fighting strength. The transformation program would supplement rather than revolutionize the Blood Angels' operational capabilities, providing specialized assets for situations that required capabilities beyond normal Space Marine parameters. Mephiston's role within this new paradigm was that of mentor and guide for the transformed battle brothers, his experience and understanding crucial for helping them adapt to their enhanced capabilities while maintaining their loyalty to the chapter and the Emperor. His own continued evolution served as both an inspiration and a warning, demonstrating the potential that transformation offered while highlighting the responsibilities that came with transcendent abilities. The Lord of Death had become more than simply the most powerful member of his chapter. He was now the patriarch of a new evolutionary branch within the Blood Angels, the first and most successful example of what Space Marines could become when freed from the limitations that had traditionally bound them. His legacy would be measured not just in his own achievements, but in the accomplishments of those who followed the path he had pioneered through his struggle against forces that sought to deny the fundamental right of conscious beings to determine their own destinies. The galaxy continued to burn with countless conflicts that demanded the attention of the Emperor's warriors, but now the Blood Angels possessed resources that allowed them to engage threats that would have been beyond their capabilities in previous eras. Mephiston and his transformed battle brothers represented a new kind of weapon in humanity's arsenal, individuals whose powers exceeded traditional categories, while their loyalties remained firmly anchored in the values that had sustained the Imperium for 10 millennia. The future would test these capabilities against challenges that were already developing across the galaxy, cosmic forces that threatened not just human civilization, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. The Lord of Death had achieved mastery over his own fate, but that mastery would be meaningless unless it could be used to secure similar freedom for the countless billions who looked to the Emperor's warriors for protection against the darkness that surrounded them. In the end, Mephiston's transformation represented more than personal evolution or tactical advantage. It was a statement about the nature of consciousness itself, proof that thinking beings possess the capacity to transcend any limitation through determination and self-sacrifice. The Lord of Death had conquered the Black Rage not through superior strength or mystical intervention, but through the simple refusal to surrender his independence to forces that sought to define his existence according to their own purposes. That refusal, and the power it had granted him, would echo across the centuries as other warriors faced similar choices between submission and transcendence. The path he had pioneered would not be easy for those who chose to follow it, but it offered something that had seemed impossible before his transformation: hope that the curses and limitations that bound humanity could be overcome through conscious effort and unwavering determination. The Lord of Death stood ready for whatever challenges the galaxy might present, his enhanced abilities matched by an understanding of their proper application in service to the Emperor and the protection of human civilization. He had become the master of his own fate, and in doing so, he had opened possibilities for others to achieve similar mastery over the forces that sought to deny them the right to choose their own destinies.